Well, hello, everybody. I'm David Blight, director of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery and Abolition at Yale, and chair of the working group and the study of Yale and slavery. One of our primary researchers and our team leader for the 18th century phase of this study is our advanced graduate student, Teanu Reid, in history and African American studies. Teanu is an expert on the 18th century Atlantic Anglo world. She is writing a dissertation still entitled Hidden Economies and Finances in the Early Anglo-Atlantic World. Her advisor for her PhD is Ed Rugemer. And Teanu has been an indispensable part of this project, I must say. And she's going to help us understand the kind of archival findings that have come out of this project and highlight some of those, particularly on the first century of Yale's history from its founding in 1701 on through the period of the American Revolution. So Teanu, welcome and thank you for doing this. Give us a sense, if you would, of a few highlights. There are many possible subjects for this, but give us a sense of a few highlights that have come out so far out of your research and the team that you're leading.
Yeah, so the biggest sort of impact that our team hopes to have on the Yale and Slavery Research Project is really exploring the history of Yale and slavery in the 18th century. So there are a few other sort of smaller pieces related to the university and its connections to slavery, but those tend to be more 19th century focused, or thinking about the aftermath of the renaming that happened in the 20th century. And our team is really digging in and looking at slave labor in the building of the college in the 18th century, donations, where there are slaveholders who are donating to the college, and really looking at Yale, New Haven, and Connecticut when slavery was still legal in the state. That's a big part of it. So one of the things that we found so far are the enslaved people who helped to build Connecticut Hall, who were owned by President Clapp and other folks who assisted in the building of the college, but also in the early labor. Additionally, we found regarding the donations, some of the donations are coming from the Connecticut Assembly in relation to sugar duties that were from sugar produced in plantations in the West Indies that were, from slave labor. So we're looking at the different ways that the university directly and a little bit more indirectly benefited from slave labor in its very early days, when it was not the giant university. It was very much a small college in New Haven.
Well, that's a great start, and I know what lies beneath a lot of that. Now, we do know that perhaps as much as 1/3 of the laborers who did all the work to build Connecticut Hall, which of course is still there over in the Freshman Quad, it's the oldest brick structure in Connecticut. Was it that unusual for these early 18th century colonial British American men to own one or more slaves? You mentioned that President Clapp, the first official president of Yale, owned a slave as well. Was it that uncommon or relatively common?
So as far as Connecticut goes, slavery wasn't the big, expansive plantation slavery that we're familiar, or many people are familiar with the South. But wealthy people in Connecticut, many of them owned one or two slaves, a few enslaved people. And in the earlier 17th century period, those might have been enslaved indigenous people, Pequots and other natives from the area. And then as you move into the 18th century, you have more enslaved Africans, and some people like Ezra Stiles, owned enslaved indigenous person. And so you do see in the early days of Yale that Jonathan Edwards, etc., like a lot of the early Yale people, whether they are the administrators or the students, there is quite a bit of slave ownership, a
Yeah.
few, one or two typically, or, smaller than several hundreds, is not big plantation slavery, but there is a prevalence of enslaved ownership amongst early Yale folk.
Now, you're an expert on the economy, the economic development of this mercantile Atlantic world by the 18th century. It turns out, well, Yale obviously existed here in New Haven, Connecticut. New Haven was the capital of colonial Connecticut at that point. It had, of course, a big harbor out there. One of the things that we're finding, and I'd love to hear you elaborate a little bit on that, is that New Haven and therefore Yale sat amidst this very robust trade between New Haven, Connecticut, for that matter, all of New England's ports, and the West Indies, especially Barbados, a major sugar growing capital of the slave society of the Caribbean. Give us a sense of that, or maybe a little sense of the scale of that, because Yale doesn't exist in any vacuum. It exists as part of this British imperial system.
Yeah, so one, Yale, especially in the early days, is benefiting from a lot of favoritism, if you will, from the colonial assembly. And so it is getting a lot of the donations from taxes from assembly legislatures to, give the university money for buildings, for books, for tools, for whatever. And so I mentioned that there are taxes levied on sugar and rum and molasses that go towards paying for the early development of the college. But also New Haven is sending, fish and cod and materials to the West Indies. There is that exchange between them and places like Barbados. There's also the history of sending some of the enslaved native peoples to Barbados and to the West Indies. So that trade exists. And then also some enslaved Africans come up to New Haven and to New England through that. So there is that exchange and that commerce that's going on. And it is an important part of the economy of New England, such that while it's not a plantation space and it's not the sort of big cotton plantations that people are familiar with, New England is very much benefiting from slavery. There's a lot of commerce that is related to the slave trade, the exchange of enslaved peoples. And so there's a lot of money being made. And then there is the labor of those people once they arrive in whatever destination that contributes further to the economy of each respective places.
We're doing this all too short interview here for our website. I mean, you and I could talk all afternoon about this as we have before. But one last question. Would you just pick something? I mean, of all the research you and your little team have done, what would be a highlight document or two, or just some sense of the kind of sources that you've been relying on here in the Yale library system to build this story of Yale's relationships with slave labor, with African slaves, with indigenous slaves? What are some of the sources that you've actually used to get at this story?
Yeah, so as far as the records and papers of Thomas Clapp, within there we found some more details about the enslaved people who built the university. And then also we found runaway slave ads related to those people. And one of the things that we really hope to show through probate records and the documents we found, we really hope to add names to the enslaved people. We really hope to be able to say who built the university, not just in terms of the big professor, president, etc., like those great white men, but also the actual labor of the college, who actually actually nail things and add them to that part of the story because they were vital and very important. And then also thinking about the relationship that develops between Yale and its position on slavery and anti-slavery a bit later in the century, working with the sermons or the publications of different Yalees who either spoke out against the slave trade or didn't condemn slavery and didn't see it as a great evil. So working with sort of those two sets of documents to really see the sort of physical building of the college, but then also on the other side, seeing how Yaleys went into the world to then affect the greater state and country eventually once after the revolution, but how they affected that larger dialogue on slavery and anti-slavery in the bigger picture.
Well, that's great. And I have to say, I mean, your approach to this research has really helped us achieve already, I think, one of the goals of this, which is to first understand what worlds did Yale exist in, when it was founded in 1701. We're also digging into who Yale was. In fact, particularly over at the British Museum, we're doing that. But it's to understand this 18th century world, this colonial imperial world, and this kind of raw, somewhat frontier society that still existed here at the beginning of the 18th century. Anyway, but it is amazing, as you well know, how, fairly obscure documents in great libraries like this can help you begin to piece that together. And then, as you say, later on in the century, we get a kind of an intellectual cultural history problem of, Yale's great thinkers like Edwards. What are they doing about slavery? Well, it turns out Jonathan Edwards owned one or two slaves through most of his adult life. So anyway, hey, Teanu, I want to thank you. This is all too short. I must say, as part of this tape we're doing, Teanu has already made a number of presentations to our working group about this and is about to make another one in the coming week. But we just wanted to illustrate a little bit about the first team we have studying the 18th century. And Teanu, it's all been about your leadership. And I should also say, you are also going to be the teaching fellow this fall in a course taught by Ed Rugemer and Crystal Feimster on Yale and slavery. So a lot of students, undergraduates, are going to benefit as well from your teaching. Well, thanks, Teanu, for taking the time to do this. And
thanks for having me.
Much more to come.